With each day that passes, the fury begets more fury. But while intense airstrikes and a chokehold blockade from Israel continue, while missile attacks from Gaza and Lebanon continue, still no ground offensive. It's reportedly on hold at Washington's request. More on that in a moment. There's the military preparations to consider, and there's politics, with two key factors. First, the hostages. What 85-year-old Yocheved Lifshitz told reporters hours after her release Tuesday holds both military and political significance. We'll ask about her words and how Israel handles the more than 200 others held by militant groups in the Gaza Strip, a situation that's a first in many flare-ups with Hamas in the past. There are open doubts over whether Israel, under this leadership, has thought through what an invasion of Gaza may mean. Reports suggest the United States, whose leaders owned up to the mistakes his country made in Iraq and Afghanistan, wants to know, beyond just revenge, what Israel has as a long-term plan. More broadly, what's the alternative to Hamas and its ideology? Today in the France 24 debate, Israel's delaying its invasion. Joining us from Tel Aviv, retired diplomat and columnist Alan Pincus, who's former Israeli ambassador to the United States. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Francois.
From Beirut, Joe Macaron, global fellow at the Wilson Center think tank's Middle East program. Welcome to the show. From the University of Geneva's Global Studies Institute, Alexandre Vautravert, editor-in-chief of the Swiss Military Review. Thanks for being with us.
Good evening.
And from Tunis, we say hi to Zaid Al-Ali, author of The Struggle for Iraq's Future, How Corruption, Incompetence, and Sectarianism Have Undermined Democracy. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Your reactions on the hashtag F24debate. Yeah, Washington making the call, according to the Wall Street Journal, reporting that Israel has agreed to delay the invasion of Gaza so the U.S. can rush missile defenses to the region. Now, Alan Pincus, it's true that we've seen militant groups attack U.S. bases near Baghdad, where there are troops stationed, that the U.S. has also been a target in northeast Syria, where it has a presence. Is that the reason, you think?
Conceivably, it's one of the reasons. I wouldn't go as far as to say, Francois, that this is the sole reason or the issue that is standing between Israel and a ground operation. And also, the report, the Wall Street Journal report that you quoted from, doesn't specify if those anti-missile systems are designed to protect or defend American personnel and American facilities and American forces, or conceivably that they are intended to be used by Israel. And so I'm not questioning the veracity of the report. I'm just saying it's just one of 4 or 5 factors that has prevented a ground operation until now.
Well, let's talk about some of those 4 or 5 factors. One of them that has us in the newsroom glued to the news wires is this insistent talk of negotiations for more hostage releases. This after Monday and that pair of elderly Israelis released by Hamas, 85-year-old Yocheved Lifshitz, made the headlines with the press conference she granted Tuesday, hours after her release, when she blasted Israel's handling of the October 7th attack. The lifelong kibbutz resident, whose husband is presumed captured, criticized for shaking hands with her masked abductors when she was freed. Perhaps lost in the noise is just how much she revealed. She stated, and I'll quote from this for you, Alexandre Vautravert. She said, "We started walking in the tunnels where the earth was moist and it was always humid. We reached a hall where we gathered some 25 people. After 2-3 hours, they separated us, 5 of us from my kibbutz." So this sounds like, first of all, that they were kept very low underground, since they're talking about it being moist in the tunnels. And second, that all this was thought out a long time ahead.
As you said, I think what we can definitely infer from this testimony is that this was a very carefully planned attack. There were many different subunits, subgroups that were involved in this attack, and the fate of one particular hostage is not necessarily tied to the others, because there are so many diverse groups within Hamas and within Gaza. And one of the attempts, one of the solutions, hopefully, to rescue as many of these hostages as possible right now, is to apply some military pressure while continuing to exercise very substantial intelligence surveillance in order to try and pick up when hostages could be moved from one particular area to another.
And a question about Hamas's planning and preparation here. On the one hand, you have the fact that they have this network of tunnels. We knew about that. But also that their public relations. First, the body cams when they went in to commit the massacres on October the 7th. And now, and she says, they were treated very well. They were careful to be to get them their medication when they needed it. Your thoughts on how Hamas is using these hostages, the strategy behind it?
Hamas has been unfortunately successful, as well as other terrorist organizations throughout the world, kidnapping people. This is not only people from a certain country, but also international observers, humanitarian workers. So this has been an increasing trend, and unfortunately has been relatively successful, because this has caused a number of negotiations to stall and a number of very precise discussions and negotiations on these hostages to sort of override all larger issues that we are dealing with today.
So, Joe Macaron, militarily, what are the options when you look at what we've gleaned so far for the Israelis going forward?
I mean, first I have to say, just we have to watch out of the narrative when we label, when we sum up the conflict as terrorism. We forget there's a Palestinian-Israeli conflict. There's a deeply rooted issues that's an imbalance in this conflict, and we also have to look at the other story, the other faces of the victims of this conflict. Just to put this into context, so we can start to analyze. Now, this aside, let's talk about the options. I mean, obviously, it's been now, I think, as you mentioned, almost 19 days. It's not clear what are the next steps. Now, so far, we have the scorched earth policy. I think there's a confusion a little bit in the Israeli establishment what to do next. So what the option can be is to go into ground invasion. This has a cost, whether in Gaza or regionally. But if the issue now is the revenge, I think the revenge was executed even on non-Hamas people who are necessarily have issues with Hamas. A lot of people have issues with Hamas, but they shouldn't be paying the price. So now I think the most important part of the next step is for the Israeli to decide what do they want. Is this a limited invasion, security belt? The Americans are giving them the time and space to basically do some sort of retaliation. But it's not clear, even for the Americans, it's not clear what do they want out of this. Obviously, there's hesitance to go into Gaza. First, they said the weather was bad. Then Biden was visiting. Now they said there's the hostages. So I think this should be movement in some sense to know. Eventually, we all know the inevitable solution is an Egyptian mediation to basically a ceasefire and exchange hostages or prisoners. We didn't get to this point yet because I think the Israeli have to decide what kind of, they are talking about a new system in Gaza, security system, how it will be, how it's going to be implemented. But so far, there's only killing of civilians. We didn't see a retaliation against Hamas itself.
Yeah, but Joe, on that point,
the ball is in the court of the Israelis.
While we're speaking, the Israeli Prime Minister has just been giving live remarks saying that the timing of an invasion will be reached by consensus. How do you interpret those remarks?
I mean, obviously, there's been a little bit of leaking from the Israeli army. Obviously, there's no consensus between Netanyahu, which is a bit hesitant, and the military. He has his own political interests. Obviously, there's the American pressure. We saw them whether on the battleground. We saw a report that our Marines and the Americans are a little bit asking to take his time to learn from the lessons of Iraq, not to rush. So I think Netanyahu has his own political survival, has to think about the establishment, has to think about the Israeli public opinion. It's not Gaza. It's not going to be easy. Both sides going to be high cost for both of them, for whether the Palestinians and Hamas, or also for the Israeli side. But I think the consensus is he means his own maybe cabinet, and most importantly him and the army, giving the American pressure context.
All right, you were asking what do Americans want with ammo, aircraft carriers, troops on standby. The United States throwing its full weight behind Israel, but it's also been quietly or not so quietly sending more and more messages to Israel, like when Joe Biden visited last week.
Justice must be done. But I caution this: while you feel that rage, don't be consumed by it. After 9/11, we were enraged in the United States. While we sought justice and got justice, we also made mistakes.
Zaid al-Ali, of course, that's a reference to Afghanistan and Iraq. Particularly in Iraq, there was this idea that the United States toppled Saddam Hussein without a plan for what comes after.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. I don't agree with President Biden that the reason why they went into Iraq was because of rage at what happened to September 11th. I mean, that was something that had been planned long before September 11th, and it was executed on the back of September 11th. But setting that aside, we can clearly see the consequences of invading a country or a territory with no plan about how to organize a territory, how to control it. And even if one were to develop a plan, there are some circumstances which just aren't workable. I just can't see any circumstance in which the United States would have been able to manage the situation on the ground in Iraq because of the circumstances that it had created. The historical circumstances. I mean, the United States was and remains an actor that's deeply distrusted in Iraq for historical reasons. And I think that analogy should be extended to any discussion that involves an Israeli invasion of Gaza.
Now comes a series of inside the Beltway sources who've been speaking to newspapers in the last days. From the Pentagon, but not just, sounding the alarm. The New York Times reporting Tuesday that in conversation with Israeli officials since the attacks on October the 7th, American officials have said they've, quote, not seen an achievable plan of action. This Wednesday, the Financial Times concurring with sources of its own, saying there are fears growing that Israel has no plan for the day after, that the Israeli system hasn't decided yet. The Americans went crazy when they realized there was no plan. Alan Pincus, these are anonymous sources. Do you believe that?
100%. Look, this is the reason why the U.S. insisted on sending 3 generals here. This is the reason why Secretary of State Antony Blinken sat in a war cabinet, something which he hasn't done in Kiev in the Ukraine in the months following the Russian invasion in February 2022. Look, we don't have time for a history seminar here, Francois. This goes back to Karl von Clausewitz. I mean, that there needs to be a coherent and clear political objective from which military means, force employment and deployment are derived. Otherwise, it's just a war and just a reciprocal carnage. Now, here's the thing: Israel has a legitimate claim. I'm not saying it's good or bad, feasible or not, but Israel has a legitimate claim saying we want to eradicate Hamas, we want to topple Hamas, we want to, as Mr. Macron pointed to a few moments ago, Israel is saying we will install a new security regime in Gaza. Fine, let's accept the legitimacy of that goal. In order to achieve that, in order to attain that, in order to somehow generate this, you need a major, large-scale ground operation, which is costly. You just pointed to sources saying that there is no plan. There are others, say David Petraeus, former general and former head of the director of the CIA, on CNN, David Soros, the former chief of the British MI6, as well as General Mark Hertling on Twitter, X it's called now. All three have basically warned Israel that even if you think you can, you can't. Now, again, I'm not casting judgment on whether they are right or wrong. All I'm saying is, answering your question, do I believe that the Americans were livid to find out that there's no plan? Yes. One more sentence, if I may. The reason the U.S. is anxious or livid or disappointed is not because an ally, Israel in this case, has disappointed them in terms of planning or executing. It's because American interests, in the eyes of America, American interests are being imperiled by what may become a series of not good decisions by Israel. And so, yes, I do believe. I mean, I made it a long answer, Francois. I'm sorry, but no. Yes, I believe these reports.
No, those are important points, and it's interesting because the pressure is not just coming from the United States. France's President Emmanuel Macron just concluded a 2-day trip to the region. It began with a call for an international coalition to fight Hamas. He made those remarks when he was in the company of Benjamin Netanyahu. He's now, I wouldn't say backpedaled, but at least qualified the idea. And after visiting the West Bank, Jordan, Egypt, warning against a ground campaign.
There's a lot of anger in the region, and sometimes support for what's going on. Why? Some say that there's a reason for all this. The fact that the Palestinian question has never been resolved, and that even the agreements that were signed have not been respected. And therefore, the Palestinian people have a legitimate right to a territory and a state. We need to address this topic, move forward, and find a political solution. I take complete responsibility for doing this now. Otherwise, in some way, we give credibility to those who say that violence is the only way to deal with this issue.
Zaid Al-Ali, you're sitting in Tunis, where there were, by the way, French demonstrations since October the 7th, when there was the shelling of the hospital in Gaza. Listening to Emmanuel Macron, do you feel as though France's position is changing, that perhaps the West's position is changing?
Well, I mean, just to reflect for a moment on President Macron's statement about the coalition against Hamas, and the analogy that he's drawing with Daesh, I mean, that quickly appeared to me as soon as I saw it as being a very, very empty slogan. I mean, there's no way that there's going to be an international coalition against Hamas, and nothing compared to the coalition that was established against Daesh for very, very obvious reasons, not least of which the leading country in the coalition against Daesh was Iraq. And the thought that Iraq or any other country in the region will join forces with France and Western countries and Israel to bomb and invade Gaza is completely unthinkable. I mean, it's more likely, there's greater chance of there being an alien invasion than there is of Iraq or Egypt joining that type of coalition. So the slogan appeared to be completely empty and completely impossible.
And by the way, Zaid, he really walked that back in those same remarks he made on the tarmac in Cairo. stating, yes, ISIS and Hamas are two very different entities.
Yeah, and he should have thought of that before, because it's a really obvious point. They're not at all the same. I mean, you know, ISIS is a group that was formed in Syria and that invaded Iraq, Mosul and Tikrit, and the population of Tikrit, for example, a city that I know very, very well because I have relatives there, all fled as soon as ISIS arrived, and they were begging for the Iraqi state to intervene and to liberate the city so that they could return home. I mean, you won't find any meaningful Palestinian organization that's currently asking for Israel to liberate them from Hamas. That's just not. There's just no comparison can be made at all. And the situations are completely different. And the only viable path forward currently is for the bombing to stop, because currently what we see over and over again on our television screens, now, currently, today, yesterday, tomorrow, is these continuous images of children, babies, being brought out from rubble, sometimes dead and sometimes alive.
And listening to Macron
no other
in
real
that
consequence
clip,
to what's happening.
Listening to Macron in that clip, do you get the sense that he's changed on this trip?
Well, I can't really speak to what's happening inside his mind. What I would say, however, is that I would definitely agree that the context in which this has happened is important. I would refer to Secretary General of the UN's comments about this issue, his full comments, including the clarifications that he made later on today, that this has not happened in a vacuum. There's a problem with the context in which this has happened, including the absence of a Palestinian state, an ongoing occupation, and the failure to respect international law from beginning to end. And those are issues that are important, that need to be resolved. You know? And I would refer once again to the full comments that Guterres made, and also to the comments that Macron made, for which more or less, I mean, I can quibble around the edges, but more or less I agree with.
Alexandre Vautravers, we've talked in the past on things that concern Europeans, which mostly has been Russia's invasion of Ukraine the last 18 months, nearly 2 years now. Your thoughts on heading into what there's going to be an EU summit on Thursday, the fact that there are these competing narratives at play?
We've always had competing narratives, and you know, I used to be a historian, so let's not get into the history of things, because then it's going to be an extremely complicated issue, and it's not going to be resolvable. I heard the comments of the United Nations Secretary General. Okay, they have merit, and they were certainly written by somebody who did this with a lot of attention. But let's face it: the United Nations intervened in this conflict in this region in 1948, just after 2 years of existence, and it is still not speaking extremely clearly about this particular issue. It's just saying that both sides or all parties involved need to respect international law. Well, okay, we have not advanced very much from that. And ultimately, the question that you could have asked is, what are the military options? Well, that's very simple. There are 2 military options. And of course, we know that the Israeli government is for a maximalist approach. And we are seeing that not only Americans, but also other stakeholders are saying that this large-scale military operation, for which almost the entirety of the Israeli military has been mobilized, this is something that is going to create an enormous amount of collateral damage. It is going to bring a lot of criticism towards Israel and all of the countries that are associated, by and large, closer or less close to Israeli action. And this is why it is now the time to discuss what is the end state, not the objective, because we pretty much agree on what the objective, but what is going to be the political end state. And here there are some very, very different propositions. Basically, the Israeli government is saying once its 450,000 military is going to go into Gaza, there will no longer be a Gaza anymore, and this territory will be reoccupied by the Israeli military. This is one option, and of course, this has all sorts of extremely dire, extremely negative consequences for political ties in the region and peace in the region. And so we need to look at other options, and other more constructive options would be to really establish a state structure, government structure. And so far, we have not gone very far. We have not made a lot of progress in the last 30 or 40 years in this regard.
It's day 19. Alexandre, are you suggesting that not going in could be an option?
It is going to be extremely difficult, because the more we wait, the more this military mobilization is costing a lot of money, and also political credibility and legitimacy for the Israeli prime minister and his coalition government. So there's a lot of pressure on their side to do something with all of this military force that has been mobilized. But as I said before, going in is not really the problem. Military units know how to do this. They have plans on how to walk into Gaza. They have had plans for the last decades. This is not the issue. The issue is, how do you resolve that conflict, and what is going to be the political end state of such an operation, realizing that there will be tens of thousands of people killed in such an operation.
Alan Pincus, what's the minimum Israel can do to be able to declare victory and perhaps spare some of those civilian lives?
That's a very difficult question. I mean, look, here's the thing. I mentioned before that toppling Hamas, obliterating Hamas, if that is even attainable, will require a prolonged military presence in Gaza. That is not something Israel is looking for, not in terms of the cost and not in terms of the political objective or end game. So what we're looking at right now is some kind of combination of continued aerial attacks, precise munition attacks, hopefully toward Hamas and not innocent civilians or non-combatants, and what is called SND, search and destroy. Search and destroy is a doctrine, a military doctrine that was developed by the Americans in Vietnam. And the idea is that you insert a force as based on tactical, as fresh as possible, as accurate as possible, obviously, tactical intelligence. The force goes in, it searches for Hamas combatants, for Hamas militants, for Hamas terrorists, for depots, for arsenals. It destroys and it swiftly gets out, meaning there's no encampment, no setting up headquarters, no no immobile military presence. The problem with that is that Gaza is a highly dense urban warfare setting, and even in the jungles of Vietnam, at some point the Viet Cong realized what search and destroy was, and they booby-trapped access roads. Now transplant that to 2023. Buildings, doors, apartments, cars, roads will all be booby-trapped. So I don't know that S&D could be as as smooth as I just described it in theory. And so for Israel, a victory would be a devastating blow to Hamas, which we have not seen now, and a sustained campaign of targeted killing, targeted assassinations against Hamas heads. And this is not a matter of weeks or months. This could take years. Only then can we declare a military victory. If you meant in your question, Francois, what would constitute a political victory, that would obviously be rendering Hamas incapacitated to the point that they cannot exert and cannot discharge and cannot exercise sovereignty in Gaza. That too is a very long process, and that will require, going back to what some of the other guests have raised, that will require a major effort in planning for the so-called day after. Because here's the thing. The Egyptians won't go in because they don't need this headache. Israel doesn't want to occupy 2.2 million Palestinians. The Palestinian Authority is not going to take over Gaza because that would be, on Israeli bayonets. So there's going to have to be some kind of an international effort, preferably based on the Arab League. That would be considered an Israeli victory. Anything less than that would be just more carnage, more bloodshed, and more deaths.
Zaid al-Ali, is there any solution possible for the long term for Gaza?
I mean, the proper solution, if one were to imagine that this could be possible, would be for there to be a Palestinian state, right, that's governing itself and that controls its own territory and that has the full support of international law and has rights and obligations under international law. That's the right solution for Palestine as a whole, not just for Gaza. But just to refer back to some of the comments that were made just now on the issue of the day after, I mean, there are some circumstances where there are no good solutions or there are no acceptable solutions even. And I referred earlier to the United States and its occupation of Iraq. It's true that the United States didn't plan for the occupation of Iraq, and there were devastating consequences, including millions displaced. We don't even know how many people were killed. It's very likely to be in the millions. It was just really a horrific time for Iraq and for the country and so on and so forth. But even if the United States had planned adequately, I'm not so sure that the situation would be any different because the United States was a highly distrusted actor, and it's very, very difficult to imagine that anyone worth their salt and that had any type of integrity would have accepted to work with the United States in those circumstances. And now the comments that were just made right now that there should be like potentially an Arab League coalition or some type to help with the day after in Israel. I mean, there is simply no way that the Arab League would participate in anything that would lead or contribute to an Israeli victory in Gaza. That is not something that's imaginable. If Israel goes in and breaks it, then it's going to own it, and it's going to have to pay for the consequences of that in the same way that the United States did. You know, nations take decisions, and they pay the consequences for those decisions. So currently, if the decision that's taken ultimately is to invade Gaza and to try to occupy it and eliminate Hamas, if that's to use the term that's been used, then it's going to end up controlling that territory, and it's going to have to pay the consequences of that, and it's going to be very, very ugly, first and foremost, for all of the innocent people in Gaza, but also for the individuals who are going to be involved in that effort. And it's going to be very, very ugly, and I don't think I'm saying anything that's going to come as a surprise to anyone. So in an ideal world, once again, we know what the solution should be over the long term. In the short term, currently, what would happen is that you would stop the bombing, because currently there's no rational connection between the scenes that we're seeing on television of babies being pulled out of the rubble, sometimes dead and sometimes alive, and the effort to recover hostages. There's just no meaningful connection between those things. So what you would do is you would stop the bombing, call it what you will. You could call it a ceasefire, you could call it a humanitarian pause, whatever, and then allow for cooler minds to prevail and stop this meaningless and senseless suffering on the part of people who have had no part in this and who've been suffering for many, many years, including the young children who are suffering these horrible consequences.
Alexandre Vautravers, what interest would Hamas have in releasing the hostages?
Well, this is a bargaining situation. So the bargaining situation is to keep these hostages and eventually release very few of these hostages over an extended period of time in order to prevent large-scale attacks from taking place. I heard a number of comments that spark interest. International action in the region, well, this exists already. As I said before, the United Nations since 1948 is present in the region and ensuring a certain number of borders. I'm not sure that the United Nations is either prepared or has the ability, and with the present East-West deadlock within the Security Council, I'm not sure that it is going to be able to be resolute enough in order to intervene. And I'm not sure that external interventions are going to be extremely helpful at this point. The other element that I would like to point to is the fact that what we are looking at is, since 2005, a situation of relative self-determination. So it's true, it's correct, we do not have yet a Palestinian state, but we do have an authority and we do have a situation of self-organization and self-rule by the Palestinians. This is a fact. And unfortunately, the attacks of October 7th have demonstrated that there is not the kind of responsibility and respect for international law and peaceful cohabitation that we would be expecting from such an authority. And this, I think, is where a lot of pressure should be exercised today.
Well, that brings us back to the remarks that were made by the United Nations Secretary General, echoing what most UN members believe, which is that the comment that's often heard that Gaza is an open-air prison.
It is important to also recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. But the grievances of the Palestinian people cannot justify the appalling attacks by Hamas, and those appalling attacks cannot justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people.
Yeah, those remarks sparked a call for the Secretary General to resign. Alan Pincus, he said he was misrepresented in his remarks. You were a moment ago talking about a possible international solution. So why the calls for his resignation?
Because anger reigns, and cool heads are not yet prevailing. The calls for his resignations are obviously nonsensical, and the calls for and the weird decision by the Israeli foreign minister not to meet him was silly. But here's the thing: if you take the UN Secretary General's speech, Mr. Guterres' speech, and read it outside the context of what's going on, there's nothing new in that speech. It's sort of balanced. Israelis may object to some, Palestinians may object to other things, but there's nothing wrong with it. If you dissect it into the components about the vacuum and the context and the 56 years of being under occupation and the statelessness and so on, again, this is nothing that we haven't heard from American presidents, indeed. But here's the problem: the timing. He chose the worst possible time and chose the most wrong and ill-fated language to say this right now. He's not a historian. He's not an academic. He is the world's leading diplomat. And it wasn't. Here's the thing: if you take his speech and then his corrections and clarifications, then he has both sides angry at him. What's the point? Going back to the point I made earlier about the UN, about the international presence, this is going to have to get to the Security Council. In order for the Security Council to approve this, you need China and Russia. In order for China and Russia to be on board, they're not going to do anything that the Americans support. It's a zero-sum game as far as they're concerned. In order to do that, they need the Arab League. They need something that's acceptable to the Palestinians. Acceptable to the Palestinians, meaning the Saudis can pressure the Palestinians. All this is highly hypothetical, but here's my point going back to the conflict. Anyone who still believes in Israeli-Palestinian coexistence, anyone who still believes that the two people can cohabit this strip of land from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. Anyone who still subscribes to the idea, to the concept, to the modality of the two-state solution has to be 100% against Hamas and has to support every and any attempt to annihilate and obliterate Hamas. No one, and I'm not for the occupation, I have my arguments certainly with this lunatic government in Israel right now, but no one in his right mind would claim that what Hamas is doing to the Palestinians in Gaza is equivalent to what Israel is doing. Hamas is holding Gaza under occupation, not Israel. I have my criticism against my government or this Israeli government, but you know,
a lot of people, Alan Pincus, are not news junkies, and what they look at are death tolls.
That is true. That is absolutely true. I wish I could argue with you, but I can't.
Maybe it's not just the Israeli intelligence, by the way, in the build-up to October 7th that dropped the ball. Put aside Egyptian claims that they warned the Israelis before the October 7th attack. Did all the parties fail to comprehend perhaps how much Hamas has changed? An offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, whose leadership in exile decamped from Syria to Qatar. Here you see Ismail Haniyeh with the Iranian foreign minister a little while back. It is clearly drawn closer to Tehran. On Tuesday, Lebanon's Al-Manar television publishing images of Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah meeting with the head of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Ziad Naleh, and deputy head of Hamas's political bureau, Saleh al-Aroui. There isn't a clear indication of when this photo was taken, but Zaid al-Ali has perhaps Hamas changed, and more importantly, has the escalation begun much sooner than we think it has?
I'm not properly equipped to talk about whether or not Hamas has changed. I'm not the right person to ask that question. I'm not an expert on Hamas or the details of its evolution.
But just when you see, Zaid, this picture of the three of them meeting under the framed pictures of Ayatollah Khomeini and the current supreme leader Ali Khamenei, it's the idea that it's already a regional conflict. Your thoughts on that?
That may very well be, but once again, I'm just not properly equipped to answer that question.
Alexandre Vautravers,
you should direct that question to someone else.
Sure. Alexandre Vautravers, do you feel as though it wasn't just Israel that misread the signs?
I'm not sure that we can say that Israel misread these signs, because already 50 years ago, in 1973, Israeli intelligence and military command and political leadership were aware of what was going on, but they were told by information coming from a certain number of sources, the United States 50 years ago, Egypt, and probably the US as well a few weeks ago, that they should not be the ones to preempt anything. And we know what has happened because of that. The only thing I can say to answer your question is that it is not really surprising that this particular conflict has flared up in the context of the war in Ukraine and a great polarization of the world. And we've talked about the deadlock that is taking place today in the United Nations Security Council, and definitely Iran, as one of the countries and parties supportive of Russia's action in Ukraine, has also been stirring up and supporting and strengthening bonds and capacities of some of its allies and proxies in order to try and flare up a number of conflicts. And I'm unfortunately very pessimistic, because I'm pretty sure this is not going to be the only conflict that is going to take place in the wake of this global polarization and arms race.
Will the U.S. and the West be drawn into it? We began the hour talking about how they were trying to dial it down and look for political solutions instead of more bloodshed.
Well, if you ask the question to me, the United States has been an actor of the Middle East already since the 1960s, so there's nothing new to that. And even if there is not a permanent presence of U.S. forces, as there was a number of years ago, we have seen with the deployment of forces coming to the rescue of Israel and also to try and stabilize the region, that they are extremely present and taking this situation extremely seriously.
Alan Pincus, was Iran making mischief, or was this all planned in Tehran?
Well, I mean, I don't know that Iran was involved in the tactical and operational planning, certainly not the execution, but Iran is certainly the inspiration. And Iran is certainly an agent of chaos throughout the region. And Iran is certainly fomenting unrest and destabilization in faraway places such as Yemen, and then Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Gaza. And Iran is now emboldened by new strategic ties with both Russia and China. And so Iran has been doing this for a very long time. To tell you that Iran was actively involved in the planning of this, I cannot. And you know, American intelligence, at least from what I've heard and read, American intelligence says that there are no signs. However, the entire issue of escalation, the entire issue that preoccupies the Americans, President Bush, Secretary of State Blinken, and others, is about Iran's proclivity or tendency, or call it what you want, to create conditions where either escalation is inevitable, or there could be, and that's the most worrying thing, Francois, a miscalculation leading to an escalation coming from Iran, which would engulf the U.S. That, I think, is paramount among American considerations.
And Joe Biden speaking in the last minute saying there's no going back to the status quo of October 6th between Israelis and Palestinians, encouraging, again, that search for a political solution to try to dial it all down. Alan Pincus, I want to thank you for being with us from Tel Aviv. I want to thank as well Alexandre Vautravers in Geneva. Zaid Al-Ali in Tunis, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.